Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots. I'm Katie Halper.
I'm Aaron Matte. Thanks so much for being here. Our website, as always, is usefulidiotspodcast.com. Go there to support the show and get bonus content. On this week's episode, we have really undisputed number one fan favorite, Norman Finkelstein, coming back to talk to us about what can you even say anymore about Gaza, all the latest there, and the media focus on the killing of 2 Israeli embassy workers, all while the U.S.-backed slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza continues every single day, unrelenting.
Yeah, it's really I don't even know what to say. There really is nothing to say. And on top of the genocide, we have the media complicity in it.
That's the thing. It's like, how do you keep talking about something that's the most important issue in the world when there's no more words left to say? It's just, but right. The only answer is just to keep talking, and that's the very minimum we can do, is just bear witness. Yeah. And that's what we do today. And Norman, as always, has a lot of insight to offer. Let's get started with the 4 basic food groups. What do we have for Democrats Suck?
So for Democrats Suck, we have yet another story about our political parties being led by gerontocracies, but it seems like it's probably worse in the Democratic Party. So as people may know, Congressman Jerry Connolly of Virginia sadly passed away earlier this week at the age of 75 after a multi-month battle with cancer. But what is significant, I would say, is that he knew he had terminal cancer. It was reported as terminal cancer. He didn't retire. And on top of that, he was actually awarded a position as the top Democrat in the House Oversight Committee in December of 2024. And that was a month after the diagnosis. And he beat AOC in that process. He got that over AOC. Part of the reason that this is an example of Democrats sucking is because, as Matt Stoller points out, by not retiring, by being kind of like narcissistic, they are actually empowering Trump. So as Matt Stoller points out, Jerry Connolly refused to retire despite having terminal cancer. He just died. As a result, there's another empty seat that would be filled by a Democrat. That makes passing the big, beautiful bill slightly easier. Matt Stoller was right that it was easier because the vote tally for Trump's big, beautiful bill Thursday morning came to 215 in favor to 214 against in the House. And I have to add that Jerry Connolly is not the only Democrat to die in office since the current congressional session began. He is the third one. And as Branko Marcetic points out, 3 Democrats who would have made the losing vote 214 to 217 died in office this year. So basically, the budget Democrats have warned nonstop is a disaster will pass directly because of their insistence that they stay in Congress until death. What do we have for Republican Suck?
For Republican Suck, let's continue on the theme of the big, beautiful bill, as Trump coins it, which has just passed by Republicans. They're very excited about it, obviously. Let's look at what it actually contains. This is Warren Gunnels with a breakdown. He's an aide to Bernie Sanders. Trump's big, beautiful bill would eliminate health insurance for 13.7 million Americans, take food away from 4 million children, end Pell Grants for 1.4 million students, cut Medicare and Medicaid by over $1 trillion, and give the top 1% a $664 billion tax break. And let's look at one aspect of this in terms of how they're going to cut Medicaid by imposing new work requirements. This is from the New York Times. The work requirement in the bill that just passed the House represents the strictest version Republicans in Congress have ever put forward. The reporting requirements are more stringent than in previous bills. It would be easier to lose benefits and harder to re-enroll. And it would apply to a large set of Medicaid recipients, including Americans previously determined to be too old to need such requirements. So basically, people who before have been said to be too old to be subjected to these work requirements are now going to be told, hey, if you want to continue to get Medicaid benefits, you have to work, even though you previously have been ruled to be not required to because of your advanced age. So that's the Republican bill. That's the big, beautiful bill that Trump is so happy about that has just passed.
Which brings us full circle, Aaron, because it's kind of ironic. Maybe that's why these Democrats are refusing to retire. They want to work long and hard in solidarity with the regular people who are now going to have to work longer and harder.
What they're also doing in this bill is gifting new tax cuts for the ultra wealthy. And here is MSNBC breaking down just how the tax cuts in this bill, coupled with the Medicaid cuts, ultimately benefit the ultra wealthy and hurt low income people.
If you're in the top 20% of Americans, you're going to get roughly a 3.7% increase in your after-tax income, really all from these tax cuts. But if you go all the way to the bottom and everything in between essentially leads you to the bottom, if you're in the bottom 20%, you actually lose $800. Why do you lose $800? You get a very small tax cut, and you get a very large cut in Medicaid and these other benefits that we were just talking about that affects the 20% disproportionately. So this is a highly regressive bill that essentially favors the wealthy, doesn't do much for the middle class, and hurts the poor. And then if you want to see this in stark comparison, if we simply eliminated the tax cuts for people making over $500,000 a year, which is roughly what President Biden was proposing, it would save $1.1 trillion. That happens to be just slightly more than the Medicaid cuts and the food stamps, or SNAP cuts, if you will, put together. So if we simply eliminated these tax cuts, we could eliminate these budget cuts on these poor people and end up, from a budget point of view, in the same place.
So great job. Big, beautiful bill, according to Trump. So beautiful to see Medicaid being cut even further. And Trump made a big thing about he's not going to touch Medicaid. Well, that's exactly what Republicans are doing now. And we'll see what happens in the Senate. There might be some opposition to this in the Senate from Republicans. Who knows with these people? But this is an assault on low-income people. This is exactly what this is.
Yeah. Useful Idiots is sponsored by CrowdHealth.com. In the last year, 1 in 5 Obamacare claims were denied to patients, and claim denials are becoming more and more common. That's unacceptable. Health insurance is confusing, expensive, and frustrating. But the headache of health insurance is exactly why CrowdHealth was created. It's not health insurance. It's a better way to pay for healthcare through crowdfunding. Hospital bills are crazy, racking up unpayable costs of tens of thousands of dollars per night. With CrowdHealth, this doesn't have to become a financial emergency. By signing up for one of their plans, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more without doctors' networks getting in the way. Let CrowdHealth help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months by using code USEFUL at joincrowdhealth.com. CrowdHealth is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com. That's joincrowdhealth.com, code USEFUL. So for Isn't That Weird, as people know by now, Wednesday night there was a shooting. 2 Israeli employees of the Israeli embassy were shot at an event hosted by the American Jewish Committee by someone who was chanting Free Palestine. But what's weird, in my opinion, is that stuff like this is getting so much media coverage, so much attention, and wall-to-wall coverage. And what's weird to me is that there's some other stories that aren't getting a lot of attention. For instance, we're not seeing a lot of news headlines about the fact that Gaza officials report that 326 malnutrition deaths, as UN says, no aid has reached Palestinians. We're not hearing a lot about that. That's kind of weird. They're also not showing Israel's live assaults that kill at least 51 in one day, 51 people in one day. Also not making a lot of news over the fact that a senior Israeli lawmaker, Nissim Vaturi, deputy speaker of the Knesset, is calling for Gaza's women and children to be separated so the men can be executed en masse. This is not a misquote. It's a genocidal call from the heart of the government, and the world says nothing. And the Gaza Health Ministry just released a comprehensive list of the number of children killed in Gaza by Israel, 16,503. It's kind of weird how openly the media and our political elites value the lives of certain people over others. And a couple more weird things I just want to point out. So let's take a look at these other weird things. And this is a story in which a Jewish man mistook 2 Israeli tourists for Palestinians and opened fire on them in Miami. Another weird thing that Remy Kanazi points out, A Palestinian 6-year-old was stabbed to death in Chicago. A Palestinian 3-year-old was almost drowned to death in a pool. A Palestinian teen was stabbed in Texas. Palestinian students were shot in Vermont. And as he points out, hate crime after hate crime as bombs continue to pummel Gaza. But what I would like to point out is, isn't it weird that those things didn't cause a media and political meltdown the way the shooting of these two people is?
Well, on that note, isn't that terrible? While the corporate media hyper focuses on these two deaths while ignoring all those other crimes that you've just outlined when it comes to violence against Palestinians from the U.S. to Gaza. Israel supporters are also using the embassy killings to, of course, demonize any supporter of Palestinian rights, including Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the head of something called the Anti-Defamation League, but people call it the Apartheid Defense League, which is a much more accurate acronym. And he went on CNN and he decided that the killing of 2 Israeli embassy officials in Washington was a good time to go and attack Twitch streamer Hassan Piker, who supports Palestinian rights and speaks often about Palestine.
All of us need to call it out. I'm thinking about the New York Times doing a gauzy profile a few weeks ago of this gamer, Hassan Piker, who regularly employs awful genocidal rhetoric against Jewish people in the Jewish state. Like, extremists should not be empowered. People who spout prejudice should not be platformed. This is a moment when we need to look ourselves in the mirror and say, we've got to stop this because the consequences are deadly.
Yeah, look yourself in the mirror and ask, do I ever put out genocidal rhetoric? And yes, I do, because I'm Jonathan Greenblatt. That's what I do all the time. And if you're the CNN host and someone says, yeah, that this streamer, Hassan Piker, adopts genocidal language, then doesn't it occur to you to say, okay, so what's an example? Like, what did he say?
Exactly.
Like you make an allegation, a very serious allegation against someone, like a public personality like Hassan Piker. Don't you want to back it up with some evidence? Aren't you CNN? Aren't you supposed to care about some remote connection to basic facts? And of course, there are none because Jonathan Greenblatt smearing Hassan Piker, as many people are doing. I think what's going on there, it's like people like Jonathan Greenblatt, they love the New York Times. They love to pick it up. It reinforces their worldview because the New York Times is constantly parroting Israeli propaganda. Occasionally, they'll throw in some token acknowledgments of Palestinian rights. But for the most part, it serves as Israeli propaganda. And Jonathan Greenblatt's still mad that he saw Hassan Piker got a nice profile in the New York Times. It just can't happen. You have to have like 100% complete uniformity. You can't just tolerate, if you're Jonathan Greenblatt, 99% uniformity with Israel. So he wants to go on CNN and complain about it.
Well, if you think it's terrible that the ADL is blaming Hassan for the shooting, you may be interested to know who the Israeli government is blaming for the shooting, and that would be none other than Israel's Democratic Party leader, Yair Golan, who is also a reserve major general in the IDF and former soldier and commander himself. He said on Israeli public radio on Tuesday that Israel is, quote, on the way to becoming a pariah state like South Africa was if we don't return to acting like a sane country. And he also said that Israel kills babies as a hobby. So, according to the Israeli government, the shooting that happened in Washington, D.C. is this person's fault. Israeli Heritage Minister Amihai Eliyahu said that Yair Golan's blood libels echo among Nazis and Israel haters around the world. We are now paying the price for them in the deadly attack in Washington, and history teaches us that we will pay more in the future. Yair, the blood of the embassy workers is on your and your colleagues' hands. My sincere condolences to the families of the murder. Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, and Kahanist and genocidal racist terrorist who actually served jail time, said, unfortunately, the anti-Semites in the world draw encouragement from villainous politicians in Israel who accuse IDF soldiers of murdering children as a hobby. The blood of those murdered by them.
And those have been your 4 basic food groups. For this week's guest, we are joined by returning champion, Useful Idiot's fan favorite, Norman Finkelstein, who so many of us rely on for his analysis on Israel-Palestine. He wrote a really important book about Gaza. Actually, one of the few works out there, the few political histories of Gaza. It's called Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. That's a vital read. And he has a new book coming out later this year called Gaza's Gravediggers, an inquiry into corruption in high places. And this is where Norman takes a look at the world's highest court, the International Criminal Court, and how basically for all the activity that's happened there, and there have been arrest warrants against Israeli leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, that's also been a source of a huge cover-up of not holding Israel to account for war crimes. And that's what Norman focuses on in his forthcoming book. But today, on today's show, we're going to talk about all the latest in Gaza and Norman's unfortunately very bleak outlook for the future. So let's go to Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein, thank you so much for coming back to Useful Idiots.
My pleasure, as always.
Let's start with what is the top news in the U.S., the shooting of two Israeli embassy officials outside an event in Washington, D.C. What we know so far is that the alleged shooter chanted Free Palestine. There's also a manifesto that's been purported to be written by him, although that we haven't confirmed that. There's so much going on in Gaza, atrocities day by day. I feel a little, it feels a little inhuman to talk about 2 deaths in Washington when there's hundreds, thousands of deaths going on in Gaza. But what is your reaction?
Well, my first reaction is that before a public, you have a responsibility not to just throw the bull. You have to have the facts and then make a careful evaluation on the basis of the facts. When I first read about this morning, my initial reaction, I thought it had occurred at the Israeli consulate. And I assumed it was a Palestinian who had committed the action. And my first reaction was to remember, I don't know if you folks will know, the fellow Herschel Greenblatt. He was the one who assassinated the second level diplomat in the German legation, I think it was in Paris. And he was Jewish, Herschel Greenblatt, and that triggered Kristallnacht. And if you look at the literature on Greenblatt, there's a lot of speculation about him. He was an obscure figure. He had reacted to reports about the forced movement of Jews. I think it was either in Germany or Poland. I think it was Poland. I can't remember. In any case, he reacted in sheer horror at what was being done to the Jews. I think it was his parents among them. And he did an act. He went into the German legation in Paris and he shot the second person in charge. Of course, the Germans called it an act of terrorism, and that's what triggered Kristallnacht. In those circumstances, given that he did assassinate a representative of the German government, and as a representative of the German government, he bears responsibility for the actions of the German government. I'm not aware of anybody who condemned Greenblatt. And I've read the literature quite closely. I'm not aware of anybody who condemned him for the act, even though you could say it was not a very smart thing to do because it triggered Kristallnacht.
When you say aware of anyone who condemned him, who are you referring to?
Historians. I mean, that was it triggered Kristallnacht. So obviously, there's a lot of talk about that incident, or a lot written on that incident. So that was my initial reaction. But then that turned out to be wrong because of 2 things. It didn't occur in the Israeli consulate. It occurred apparently in front of a Jewish museum in Washington. And secondly, it's unclear at this point whether the alleged perpetrator or whether he was even aware that these 2 people worked in the Israeli consulate, or they just happened to be in front of that museum. So that throws a large number of variables into the equation. I did read the alleged manifesto he wrote, everything alleged because we really don't know. And I have to say, it was at quite a high level of sophistication. He talked about an incident in Guatemala with a Guatemalan doctor who was operating on some patients, And then the Guatemalan, what were they called back then? They weren't called terrorists, paramilitaries. They came into the hospital and they killed the patient. And the doctor commented about how he sees the murderers walking in the streets all the time with that heartless grin. And then he talked about an incident with a figure who was very famous in my generation, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara.
Right.
The Vietnam War was famously called McNamara's War. And somebody who sought revenge on him. And I know the Vietnam War like the back of my hand, and I wasn't even aware of this incident. So I'm bringing it all up because there seems to be this big disconnect between a sophisticated manifesto and a fellow just going randomly in front of a Jewish museum in Washington and attempting to assassinate two people who presumably he thought were Jewish, although there's no reason even to presume they were Jewish. It could have been just visitors going to the museum. So everything remains foggy now. I would say for me, a bottom line is it could have been a nutty guy. That's always possible. Ted Kaczynski, he was a Harvard graduate. The manifesto he wrote wasn't altogether crazy, but he embarked on a crazy project, one by one assassinating individuals who he believed were responsible for bringing us to the point of destruction. So it could be a smart guy with a crazy project. It could be a crazy guy with a crazy project. I don't really know. I would leave it there.
It's interesting. I just have to add that one of the victims of the shooting, they were both employees of the Israeli embassy, and one of them is a Christian Zionist who emigrated to Israel from Germany and joined the IDF and became a citizen. I wanted to though talk about the way this incident is being responded to, and then of course we're going to talk about what the media should be talking about, which is the murder and starvation of Palestinians. In fact, I believe Asal Rod tweeted out something very clever like, so this is what media coverage, wall-to-wall media coverage looks like. It's been a choice up until now, implying that, the wall-to-wall media coverage of this killing is what we should have been seeing about the killing of Palestinians. But here's one response, which comes from Florida Congressman Randy Fine. Let's hear how he responded to this shooting.
The fact of the matter is the Palestinian cause is an evil one.
Yeah, and Congressman, there is a ceasefire deal on the table right now that the White House is hoping both Israel and Hamas will sign on to. Does this shooting change anything when it comes to the course of the war or the negotiations to end it?
Well, I think it speaks to the importance of the only end of the conflict is complete and total surrender by those who support Muslim terror. In World War II, we did not negotiate a surrender with the Nazis. We did not negotiate a surrender with the Japanese. We nuked the Japanese twice in order to get unconditional surrender. That needs to be the same here. There is something deeply, deeply wrong with this culture, and it needs to be defeated.
So how do you respond to that, Norman?
How do I respond to that? Well, the logical conclusion is that we should just nuke the whole Arab world if it's the quote unquote culture, Muslim culture, fundamentalist culture. I don't know what he has in mind, but the logical conclusion would seem to be that we should just nuke the whole Arab world and that would solve the problem. I don't really, honestly, you reach a point of derangement where it just doesn't seem sensible to engage it. He has the right to say whatever he wants, but to invoke the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in light of the killings of two individuals in Washington is just a degree, a magnitude of derangement and insanity that it's very hard to engage.
Yeah.
one should try, I think, to stick to factual issues and not psychiatric ones.
But the problem here is that people like that are not only members of Congress, as Randy Fine is, but inside Israel, that kind of thinking is very dominant. You have Israeli politicians openly talking about how every baby in Gaza is our enemy. And unfortunately, these views are widely held. I mean, like, what are your thoughts on Israel right now in terms of its place as a unique society on the spectrum of lunacy, of just collective insanity, in the same way that Nazi Germany was an example of just outright collective insanity? Like, where do you situate Israel in that right now?
To be perfectly honest with you, as I should be, I do meditate on that question a lot. And I'm not really sure if my historical scope is sufficient to make a balanced judgment. What I would say is the following things: nothing in extenuation, just putting it in the right historical context. There was a very good book written probably about 30 years ago now by a fellow named John Dowers, Dowers. It was called War Without Mercy. And it was a description of the kinds of language, public presentation during the U.S. war with Japan. And it was on both sides. The Japanese demonizing to the point of satanic description of the U.S., meaning everyone in the U.S., and the U.S. doing the same thing with the Japanese. If you read the book, it's very, very ugly. How the U.S. depicted the Japanese, the attitudes towards the tortures of Japanese, the glee at, for example, the incineration of Tokyo during World War II. I mean, glee. Then if you read about our own Indian wars, as they were called, the kinds of insanity that came out of very respected figures. Even in retrospect, if you read Theodore Roosevelt's The Winning of the West, it's a 5-volume work he wrote, and his descriptions of Native Americans will make your skin crawl, I believe. So in that respect, you can't say Israel is completely aberrant in the historical. In the broad history, these kinds of psychopathic outbursts are not unusual, especially after October 7th, where kind of all the demons in Israeli society, which for one reason or another they had to repress or suppress, all the demons rose to the surface, and all of the ugliness of that society. They felt they now, after October 7th, they had license, they had moral license to publicly espouse. I think a lot of it was repressed. It was there. If you scratched the surface with any Israeli, their loathing and contempt for Arabs in general and Gazans in particular. It was there, but there was always, it's a Western country, so there was a veneer of being civilized. And what October 7th did was it enabled the Israelis to free themselves from that veneer and for all the demons to rise to the surface. I would say, on the other hand, I would say Israelis, unlike Nazi Germany, they don't have the pretense or the pretext that they didn't know what was happening. Now, I'm not saying Germans didn't know. Germans, even though it was a totalitarian state, even though they were being barraged with the propaganda of this being a Judeo-Bolshevik war that was being unleashed on Germany, that it was because of the Judeo-Bolsheviks that the German soldiers were freezing to death, literally, on the Eastern Front. And they're being barraged with this propaganda over and over and over again, incessantly. The fact is, they may not have known about the concentration camps or the death camps. They knew about the concentration camps. Did they know about the systematic extermination? There is debate about that, but they certainly knew enough to know something horrible was happening. Because you have to remember, 50% of the Jews who were killed were just lined up and shot down. They weren't in Auschwitz or in concentration camps. It was on the front. They're lined up, shot down, in some instances like Babi Yar, in the tens of thousands. So somebody had to be doing the shooting. And there had to have been conversation about what was happening. So they knew. But they have a pretext or a pretense that they didn't know. The propaganda, the totalitarian state, and so forth. In Israel, everybody knows. At the beginning, even people like Gideon Levy, who I respect for sure, even they were saying, well, the Israeli media is disguising what's happening, and the Israeli media is just an echo chamber of Netanyahu and his cohorts. And so the Israelis are poorly informed. That's with all due respect to Gideon Levy, that's complete nonsense. Israel has the highest usage of the internet of any country on earth. The Israelis were posting on the social media what they were doing. So whatever Haaretz or Yediot Aharonot or the others were saying, the Israeli soldiers were posting and boasting of what they were doing. Every Israeli knew and knows exactly what's happening. What has happened since October 7th, it is incorrect to describe it as a state project. That's incorrect. It's a national project. Israel has a citizen army. It's representative of the cross-section of Israeli society. The people carrying on the genocide are representative of, anchored in Israeli society. If it's not the person, him or herself, it's an uncle, it's a father, it's a brother, it's a son. They all know. A daughter. They all know, they all approve. Every poll taken since October 7th has shown that roughly 95% of Israelis believe, knowing full well what's going on, 95% believe that Israel is using enough or too little force in Gaza. That is, 40% think Jewish Israelis believe that Israel is not using enough force in Gaza. So, in answer to Aaron's question, I have to be sensitive to other historical examples I've seen. For example, the US with Japan, the US during the Indian Wars. On the other hand, I do think that at least in the current world, let's say since World War II, this is in a class all its own for many reasons. I mean, the sheer numbers, since the 21st century, the last 25 years, it's unique in every category. There's just nothing like it. If you use any metric whatsoever, this falls into a totally different category, what Israel is doing in Gaza. And in terms of it being a national project, yes, I do believe it falls into a category. Then the implicit question in what Aaron asked is, what degree of legitimacy does Israel lose as a consequence of the last 19 months? Does it lose its right to exist as a state? Does it lose any moral legitimacy any longer as a state? I'm sure people wake up thinking that place needs to be wiped out. And I try very hard to reason it through. What does the past 19 months mean? But you can ask yourself, Aaron, the Japanese committed horrific atrocities during World War II. I mean, they killed 25 million Chinese. That very little place called Japan, 25 million Chinese they wiped out. And we don't have to talk about the atrocities committed by the Germans. But very soon after World War II, for better or for worse, they rejoined humankind. So I don't have an answer. I suppose it's the job of a historian to ponder it. But right now, I guess now is not the time to ponder it. Right now, I think the job is to chronicle it accurately and do what one can do in the current circumstances, which seems rather limited, and to bear in mind who are the culpable characters here. Who are the culpable characters here? And to be accurate about that. Is it Trump? Right now, Trump is the head of state. But did he begin it? Did he open the door? Did the horrors begin with his inauguration? That's just not true. I get many emails every day from people who are feeling hopeless, hoping that I can show some light at the end of the tunnel, and I can. There's just something so morally abominable, and this is already a cliche, and I try not to lapse into cliches, that the Times has 3 articles on this couple.
The couple in D.C. who were killed. Yeah.
And 3 days ago, it was reported that 14,000 Gazan babies would die in 48 hours if food doesn't get to them. I think that might have gotten one sentence in the Times. 14,000 babies will starve to death if food doesn't get to them within 48 hours.
Now, there was some controversy about that warning because there was a question whether that was the exact precise warning or whether the warning was simply that there were 14,000 babies in Gaza who were at risk of starvation. But regardless, whether it's 48 hours or starvation over a longer period, it doesn't matter. The point is the figure was 14,000 babies are seriously at risk over some period of time. And
have already they have already been dying of it. That's the other thing that one would think would be noted by our media. That children are starving to death. Not starving to death, they're being starved to death.
And that just wouldn't have happened.
And to hear the rest of the interview, please go to usefulidiotspodcast.com.
As always, it's wonderful to be joined by Norman Finkelstein. This is a really long interview, so if you want to see the full interview, you can find that at usefulidiotspodcast.com.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Useful Idiots. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiotspodcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.